Sarah Beth, I will let you take it away. And do you want to do intros? Do you want me to introduce?
I can take it. Thanks, Haley. Hi,
All right,
everyone. Sarah Beth Berman here. I'm the CEO of the American Journalism Project, and I'm really delighted to be here, particularly because the topic of philanthropy and journalism is one that we at the American Journalism Project are really passionate about. We think philanthropy has an essential role to play in the rebuilding of local news. And we think philanthropy professionals, which many of you are really at the front lines of convincing philanthropists to join this arena. And one of the questions that philanthropists often want to know is, am I investing in something that will be sustainable over the long term? i.e., do you have a revenue team that rocks? Our topic today. So that is what we are going to focus on today. I'm going to introduce our great panelists. I'm hoping that Jillian White's going to be able to join us also, but we are in good hands with Maple and Bruce. But before I introduce them, let me just briefly mention a little bit about what the American Journalism Project is for those of you who don't know. The American Journalism Project is a venture philanthropy organization, which means we raise national philanthropy and we use that to facilitate the growth of the nonprofit local news sector. We invest in existing organizations to help them grow. We also help to launch new enterprises by incubating talent early on, and then also by partnering with local philanthropy to help seed and launch new enterprises through something we call a startup studio. Some of you may have seen actually today, hello, Jillian, we have you. Some of you may have seen today the announcement of Houston Landing, which is an outgrowth of the program that I just mentioned, working with local philanthropy to launch now a $20 million nonprofit, nonpartisan digital startup in Houston that will launch later this year, but they announced their name and their leadership. So everyone go on social media and follow them. We're very excited about that today. We have invested we've committed $40 million to a portfolio of 36 organizations from Mississippi to Montana to Puerto Rico. And we make our investments exclusively focused on the revenue and operational capacity of organizations because we think that is essential to growing nonprofit news so that it can be sustainable and so that we can do great journalism that serves communities. We're going to talk today about building great revenue teams. And so I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists and then let them also introduce themselves a bit. First, Bruce Putterman, who is the CEO of CT Mirror. CT Mirror was one of the American Journalism Project's very first investments. We made a growth investment. They had been doing great work for, I think, almost a decade when we invested in them. And we invested in Bruce and his team to build out their revenue team. And we're going to hear about this, but they've gotten some really remarkable results from that, from the process of building a revenue team that rocks. So that is great. I'm excited to hear from you, Bruce. I also want to introduce Jillian White, who is the Senior Vice President of Revenue and Programming at Capital B. She was on the founding team over there. Capital B was an organization that the American Journalism Project incubated in 2020. Akoto Aforiata and Lauren Williams, the co-founders of the American Journalism Project, called us up with a really bold idea to build a nonprofit news organization that served local Black audiences across the country. We gave them some seed funding and some support, and they turned that into an organization that launched last year. I think we're just getting to your one-year anniversary like a couple days ago.
Yesterday.
So, yeah, that's right. And previously, Jillian was at Atlantic Media. And then finally, Maple Walker Lloyd is at Block Club Chicago as the Director of Development and Community Engagement. Before she was with Block Club Chicago, she came from the philanthropy world where she was at MacArthur Foundation. For those of you who don't know Block Club Chicago well, go learn more about them. They are in the nonprofit news sector, one of, if not the kind of highest performing organization in terms of reader revenue. They've really done an extraordinary job of captivating readers to give, to make commitments to the organization and support it. And we made an investment in Block Club Chicago, I think now 2 years ago, and have supporting them and building out their revenue team to diversify that revenue to more and larger revenue streams. So we are going to talk about that today. Bruce, I'm going to start with you, but would you just go ahead and introduce yourself and a little specifically the role that you're playing at CT Mirror, and why don't you also introduce the structure of your revenue team, and then we'll have each one of you do the same. So Bruce, over to you.
Great. Well, thanks, Sarah Beth, for inviting us to participate, and everybody at Lenfest. It's an honor to be here. So I am the publisher / CEO of the Connecticut Mirror. Our mission is to inform Connecticut about public policy, hold government accountable, and amplify diverse voices and perspectives. And kind of translated, that translates to, we focus on public policy in Connecticut, policy, government, politics. There's a lot of talk of news deserts around the country. Connecticut is not a news desert, but it is what is referred to by Penny Abernathy, who many of you know of, as news poverty, where all of the established news organizations have shrunk considerably to the point where no one's really doing explanatory journalism, investigative reporting, providing context on stories. There's plenty of kind of who, what, when, and where in Connecticut still, but there isn't any why and how. And that's the role that we are filling, to the point where the 14 largest daily newspapers in the state actually license our content to put into their print and digital newspapers, to at least provide that to their readers, even if they're not publishing it on their or developing it on their own, reporting it on their own. In terms of our revenue team, so yes, when in November of 2019, when we got that fateful call from AJP that we were in the first cohort of grantees, there were 9 of us. There were 8 journalists and me. So I did all the operations and the revenue and the finance and HR, whatever. And we had proposed AJP. And I think part of the reason AJP invested in us, Sarah Beth, is we had achieved a pretty strong reputation, built some trust, was doing really quality work for a long period of time. And I think your guys' thinking was, well, if they can do that with one guy doing revenue and operations, imagine what they could do with a few people. And so that's what has happened over the 3 years of the grant. We added 4 more people to the revenue team over the 3 years. So right now, the revenue team is a major gifts person, a membership person, small dollar donations, an audience person, and then a kind of donor operations, donor database manager kind of person, and me. And so the major gifts person is the only person who's dedicated to revenue, because our membership person is also our, we're all small nonprofits, right? Our membership person is also our technology person, and our audience person obviously reports into both revenue and editorial. And our ops person does, she's a jack of all trades, if you will. So that's kind of the structure. I'll maybe stop now and let someone else go, and then can fill in the details.
Great. We're going to hear more about that. Jillian, can I ask you to go next? It would be great to hear a little bit about Capital B, but also how you guys have structured your revenue team now 1 year in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. So Capital B, as Sarah Beth said, we are a national and local nonprofit news organization focused on Black audiences specifically. At the local level, we're really focused on helping Black people and Black communities navigate their communities, navigate politics, be civically informed, and really give them the information that they need to make the best choices for themselves, their families, and their communities. And at the national level, we're focused on accountability and centering Black people and Black stories in the larger narrative of this country and things that are happening there, for all of the reasons that I'm sure we all know as engaged news people. So I won't go into more detail there. 1 year in, what does our revenue picture look like? I will say, even in a year, it has changed and been fluid. Like Bruce, I'm sure, like everyone who is running a small-ish nonprofit, it's a lean revenue team, and a lot of people are playing kind of double duty. So when you talk about membership, for instance, membership falls on my team, the revenue team, but it also obviously falls under our audience, who is helmed by our chief audience officer, Akoto Foriata, who's also a co-founder. We have, so the people who are really focused on revenue kind of full-time, there's me, there is our development director, and then there's our head of development. So kind of a small-ish team. And then obviously we borrow from our CEO. She will come to a lot of our foundation meetings with us and do that work. I mostly helm up earned revenue. And then we are still working on memberships and a couple of other revenue streams as well. And that is kind of a mix of myself and our two founders. Sarah Beth, I think you're.
Thank you. Sorry, still learning. Maple, I would love to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to give you guys a quick rundown of Block Club Chicago, we are a nonprofit reader-funded journalist-run newsroom that's reflective of and responsive of Chicago's diverse neighborhoods. And what makes us so unique is our reporters are embedded in the communities that they cover. So they don't parachute in once or twice to tell a story. They're literally in their neighborhoods every single day building trust. And many of our reporters mirror the diversity of the communities that they serve as well. And now kind of shifting gears and just to talk a bit about our revenue team. There's me, and I have a hand in a little bit of everything: grant reports, proposals, individual donations, advertising, community engagement work. And now we're starting to dive a bit deeper into sponsorship opportunities. We hired our VP of revenue back in September, and she's really helping us behind the scenes, whether that's with our CMS, our CRM, our tech stack, and making sure all of those processes flow and work together. And then our co-founders, they also have a hand in these areas to a certain degree, even more so with our subscriptions and merchandise sales. And just this week, which is super, super exciting, Monday, our operations coordinator just started, and his role is to support our leadership team in helping us streamline our workflow.
Excellent. Maple, I'm going to send this back to you, but one more sort of table setting question, and then we'll get into discussion. Can each of you just walk through your revenue pie right now? So what are your revenue streams and what percentage of your revenue are they?
Absolutely. Okay, so this is year 5 for Block Club. And for about the first 3 years, Block Club was over 70% reader funded. And thanks to 2 significant investments that we received over the past 2 years, we're not relying heavily on one source of revenue. So 45% of that revenue now comes from foundations. About 40% comes from our subscribers. And then the remaining 15% comes from individual donations, advertising, and merchandise sales.
Everyone should go check out Block Club Chicago's swag. They have great merchandise. It really explains why they have such a great merchandise.
Sarah Beth, I actually forgot to put on a hat or a shirt. So
yeah.
You
know? Jillian, I'll toss this to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, in terms of duration that the organization has been around, I think what Maple said was really useful, because I think everyone's goal is to diversify more as you grow and as you've been there for a longer time. We've just hit our 1-year birthday yesterday. Happy birthday, Capital B. So right now we are about 85% foundations. We are probably a little under 10% memberships. And then we have major gifts, and earned revenue is probably the smallest part of the pie for us right now. Over the next 5 years, we're hoping to grow those other 4 streams and then also add merchandising as well. So eventually our pie might look a little bit more like Maple and Block Club Chicago's does.
All right, and we are 48% major gifts. So we define a major gift as $1,000 or more. About 10% membership. I know for AJP purposes, we count that as non-contributed revenue, but we think of it as contributed because there isn't a quid pro quo for, you get to read only if you pay a membership fee. 32% foundations, but that number will probably go down in 2023 because we will not have the AJP grant, which was a considerable foundation grant the last 3 years. And then only about 10% of our revenue is earned. About 5% is advertising, and the other 5% is the content licensing that I mentioned before.
Great. Bruce, I'm going to come back to you right now with this question, which is, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how to determine the size and structure of your revenue team.
I mean, I guess it all basically started with our proposal to you back in 2019, and kind of knowing, and you all were great about being flexible with this. So we kind of put our best shot on paper, which was to have a major gifts person, a membership person, and an ad sales / ad sponsorship, a sponsorship sales person. And with a little bit of experience, it struck us, well, there's probably not there's not as much potential in the ad sales as we thought. So we reinvested that in kind of an operations support role for revenue. Then
I'll just point out, I think this is a key point here. We hear this a lot. People just think like, okay, what are the revenue streams? And now I'm just going to get a person for each revenue stream. And yes, I see Jillian shaking her head. No. Yeah. Bruce, I think you kind of gave insight into why that isn't always the right logical line of thinking.
Yeah, right. It's a return on investment question, ultimately. And it's also ultimately about the skills and talent and interests of the people that you actually bring on board. So it's kind of always a moving target, I think. I guess what I would just say to anybody who's also asking that same question of themselves, Sarah Beth, is just try something and you will then kind of be able to nip and tuck and finesse and figure out what you ultimately need as you evolve.
And before I move on from you, Bruce, can you talk specifically about this, the development director? You brought in a development director and you saw sort of immediate returns from that. Can you talk about that?
Sure. So the interesting thing about the development director is that we hired a development director with no development experience. She was a journalist. And I know, Jillian, that's where you come from as well. And maybe you do as well, Maple, I don't remember. But in any event, we talked to a bunch of executive recruiters in Connecticut, and they said, look, you're ultimately still a $2 million nonprofit, and there's just a revolving door of not great development people in the small nonprofit sector. You might want to think a little more creatively and look beyond that usual revolving door. And so we hired a journalist, and Emily Ramshaw of the 19th had written a great piece a couple of years ago that compared fundraising to journalism, how they're so similar. It's about storytelling and research and asking tough questions. And so I drank that Kool-Aid, hired a journalist, and we hired a coach for her, and she had 10 one-hour development coaching sessions where she learned kind of the art and the science of development. I worked closely with her, and it's been great. She, just last week converted a $15,000 major or family foundation into $25,000. This week, she converted a $5,000 family foundation to a $25,000 family foundation. So I'm not sure if that fully answers the question. I guess I'll just say this, that the qualities that were most important, I think, were smart and curious and a learner and innovative and fearless.
Yeah, great. Maple, I want to turn to you, which is, when you talked about Block Club Chicago and its aims of really serving the communities and building a diverse and equitable organization that reflects the communities of Chicago. I'd be interested in how you think about that lens with development and centering diversity, equity, and inclusion in a development and fundraising team.
I absolutely love this question. And I think there's a lot of variables that newsrooms have to look at. So when you think of DEI internally, I think newsrooms should be asking, how does your staff and leadership reflect that? Do you include people of color in important conversations? Do they have a voice? Do they feel valued? Or is your team set up to make it look like things are great from an outside perspective? And one of the things that I've always really respected about Block Club is that it's more than just checking a box. Our board is led by a Black woman. On the business side, there's me. And then on the editorial side of the newsroom, one of our senior editors is also a Black woman. And as I mentioned early on about our staff, our reporters mirror the diversity of their neighborhoods. And then in terms of DEI, when you think about our coverage, we were founded to make the news more equitable and accountable to Chicagoans, regardless of where they live in the city. And we're able to do this because our reporters are showing up and they're in the neighborhoods every single day. And most of our coverage is focused on the south and west sides of Chicago, and our work is in line with the mission and priorities of some of our funders. Just quickly, for an example, one of our funders that supports us, they are not only focused on the communities that we serve, but then the DEI aspect when it comes to our staff and our leadership. So I just want to be clear about one quick thing. We don't check boxes to receive funding, but DEI is 1000% in the forefront and part of our mission and aligns with the mission of our funders.
Thanks, Maple. I want to call out two comments I'm just seeing in the chat here. It's worth taking a look at the chat. One was someone just highlighting the importance of coaching and training for someone who has potential but no experience. I think a lot of development skills a lot of people have, and you can find people with the skills and coach them. And then also Patty Slutsky, who's the Chief Advancement Officer at AJP, mentioning, just echoing the point that evaluating revenue teams, like considering how your staff can line up with the potential of the revenue streams, is a really important framework for thinking about staffing your team. Maple, you just talked a lot about sort of how the revenue team lines up with the vision of the organization, which leads me to my next question that I have for all of you, which is, how are you integrating or not integrating your revenue team with the editorial or the rest of the organization in particular? I think a lot of us who know the news business are well aware of the kind of history of keeping the business side separate from the editorial side. And so I'm interested in how that plays out in your organization, both what's working and what the challenges are. Jillian, why don't I start with you?
Yeah, this is a question that is near and dear to my heart. As Bruce said, I am not a business person normally in a news organization. I am a journalist and was a managing editor at The Atlantic for a long time before I fully switched to the business side here at Capital B. And I think it's really important to have former journalist, on the business side for this reason. If you are a journalist, you understand the bright lines and you understand why they exist really well, kind of in like a visceral, instinctive way. And it's because in a journalistic capacity, you need to be able to speak truth to power. You need to not be worried about saying the truth about something because you're worried that it's going to mean that someone gets fired or that you lose an ad or that somebody doesn't want to sponsor something anymore. Like, those are not concerns that you can have in your mind as you are out doing your research, reporting, writing those things. Otherwise, the entire integrity of your newsroom is compromised. The integrity of your journalism is compromised. And if we've learned nothing over the past decade or so, trust in newsrooms, trust in journalists is hard to come by, even when it is earned, even when those newsrooms are doing the work the way that they should be. So if you give people a reason to not trust you as a journalist, that's it. Like, the jig is up, it's over. So it's extremely important that you understand as an entity kind of where that separation occurs. That being said, I think sometimes journalists and business people have not been given enough credit that you can hold two things in your mind at once. Like, it is possible to understand that, we want to do a big package of coverage around climate change. And because we want to do that big package of coverage that is so above and beyond what we normally do, we need to seek out additional funding specifically around this package of coverage. And thus, we need to understand what those stories might look like, why this is important now, to be able to tell that story, as we talked about earlier. And this is also why I think it's great having journalists on the business side. A lot of what foundations, companies, funders want to know is they want to understand the story of why you are doing this work, why you're doing it now, and the way that you're doing it. And somebody on the business side needs to be able to tell them the story and break down the fundamentals of, what is the ROI, or why am I investing this much, or how does that make sense, or how does that fulfill your needs? You need to be able to do both things. So for us, I think it hopefully is made easier by the fact that I am a journalist and I understand where those limitations are. I understand when it's appropriate to bring a journalist or an editor into the conversation and when it's not. But I think, to the point that we were talking about earlier about understanding who people are, what their talents and their capacities are, that is also true of where this line is, right? There are some editors who completely understand that business is business and reporting is reporting, and they can have a conversation with the business side so we can price things accurately or something like that. And it has no effect on their ability to go then receive reporting, edit it accurately. There are other people who are like, I cannot know in any way, shape, or form what is happening on the money side because it is going to affect the way that I do my job. And those people shouldn't be brought into the conversation. They should be left to the integrity of their work. So for us, I think at all organizations, it really is a question of both seniority, what role the person holds, whether or not they can kind of hold some of those competing issues in their minds, and then also just understanding where to draw the line. It doesn't have to be that we never ever talk about money with our journalists. They have no idea how things work. Because I think, to be honest, that's how journalism gets in trouble sometimes. People need to understand how their salaries are paid, and they need to understand kind of that revenue pie that we talked about. There's a reason that you see ads on your work, or there's a reason that, the CEO is out talking to a specific foundation right now instead of, here at this particular meeting. And it's because that is the way that we derive the revenue that, helps us pay salaries, helps us pay for journalism, helps us do all the cool and important things that we need to do. So I think drawing those lines in a way that makes sense based on who your team is, what you're trying to accomplish, and what conversations you're having is really important, instead of kind of having this hard, fast, bright red line that, spans across all organizations.
Great. Bruce, I'd be interested in your perspective as the CEO of the organization. How do you aim to sort of set that up, particularly in an organization that for so long really didn't have a business team other than the executive director and has built that in a relatively short period of time?
Yeah, I think, so I am not a journalist. Other than 4 years as a radio reporter in college many, many years ago. What I did bring was nonprofit management perspective. So I just offer that. But I think the secret sauce, in terms of your question, Sarah Beth, is ultimately a great partnership between me and our executive editor, and trust and candor, and willingness to communicate about hard issues that kind of straddle the line that you're talking about a little bit, Jillian. Now, because you're right, sometimes that line is not bright. So for example, Beth Hamilton, our editor, understands that I can do my job more effectively going out and talking to people about supporting the organization if I have some window into what's going on in the newsroom, or what some of the thinking was behind stories that we've published. I can do my job better if I can bring reporters to fundraisers or to public events at which we might then ask for money. I know some of our peer organizations are doing like, donor briefings where they talk about stories that have published and give a little peek into the kitchen about how the journalism is developed. And then also importantly, as you referenced, Jillian, the last thing our editor wants is for me to come back to her with a grant signed, sealed, and delivered that she hasn't had some role in participating in. So there is some fluidity in terms of the relationship enhanced by trust. And finally, what I would say is, as I say to people, we are not a radio station disc jockey. We do not take requests, but we will seek funding for, like Capital B, we will seek funding for specific projects or beats that we want to add.
Bruce, you listed for us the qualities that you felt were important in hiring your development director. Jillian, I'd be curious, and Jillian, you talked about the importance of having some journalism on the business team that experience that is a really useful perspective. I'd be interested, Jillian, if there are other qualities or things that you've come to realize are really important as you hire and build out your team.
Yeah, I think the ability to ask questions, to be strategic, to connect the dots. I think that's a huge benefit on the business side. I think a lot of what we're seeing in journalism continually is this changing nature of the business. It has been changing for over a decade now. It will continue to change and continue to morph. And I think the people who do the best are those who are able to spot opportunities and connect the dots in places where it may not be, quite so direct and upfront. The model is not just, here's an advertiser, we sell ads. That is the whole story anymore. It's not even that way for, for-profit institutions. So I think the ability to say, hey, we've been doing really great coverage around this particular topic. I see that the values of this company, this foundation, or whatever are aligned in this way. They, have teach-ins, they have lunch and learns, they have all these other things. What is a product? What is a way that we can get our journalism out there in a different way? What is a way that we can connect these dots that maintains our journalistic integrity, but also meets the needs of whatever this funder might be particularly interested in? So everyone's a winner here, right? So somebody who can kind of think outside the box in that way, who's not just thinking, advertising, or we ask you for a grant, it has these very specific parameters and then it's done. I think the other thing that we see from both funders and corporations is they want more meaningful partnerships. They want to feel like the money that they are investing is going to a true cause that they value and is going to they're going to see some sort of return on that, whether or not that's a financial return or a return in the community, a return of impact, whatever it might be. And I think being able to really think about how you're going to derive that and how you're going to be able to show that and think outside of the box about those things, that's something that I really look for, which is a little bit different than, has 15 years development experience and has gotten, X amount in grants. There's some level of intangible there. And, to the point in the chat earlier, some of these things can be trained, some of the, mechanics of, writing up grants, proposals, and things like that. Some of that stuff can be trained. Some of this stuff, like the intangibles, the ability to connect with people, the ability to tell a story, that stuff is harder to train. So when you find it, it's almost worth going for a person who has those kind of intangible qualities, those untrainable things that you think your organization needs to connect those dots, and just get them trained up on the other stuff that, it might take a year for them to perfect, their grant writing, but they can, you can get that done. You might spend 5 years with somebody who's a great grant writer, and they never really quite connect the dots in the way that really gets money in the door or gets your message out there in the way that you need to.
Great. I have many more questions and I'm going to continue asking, but I really do want to invite people in the chat to ask their questions. I'm going to ask one more question of you, Jillian, which is that you come from the commercial news sector before this. You were at Atlantic Media, and when you started at Capital B, you were focused entirely on earned revenue, I believe, and now you've taken over the full remit of revenue, including fundraising. I'm interested in you talked about some of the similarities, but where are the differences between thinking about earned revenue and where are the similarities? I think that would be interesting to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, so obviously at the Atlantic, we were focused 100% on earned revenue and turning a profit, having a significant profit margin. And part of the reason that the job at Capital B was so appealing to me was the nonprofit structure, the ability to really align with people who are giving us money, who are willing to donate, who are willing to fund, who are aligned in value and in mission, and thus the ability to just say no sometimes, to say, no, that type of coverage doesn't make sense for us. No, your vision of what this looks like doesn't make sense for us. No, you've done something recently that shows, substantive harm to our community. And thus, no, we don't want to take your money to be part of like a rehab process. That for me feels really different. I think when you're in a for-profit organization, and I think the Atlantic was actually quite good at this, and always listened to me when I had these concerns. But, at a for-profit institution, you are really hard pressed to not say no. You're hard pressed to kind of take every extra dollar when you hit goal to have more, just to constantly kind of like bring more in. That's the nature of for-profit media, and it makes a lot of sense. So for me, the difference is really just that underlying mindset of, we want to partner with people who have similar values, similar missions, who believe in our mission, who want to support that. And if those things don't line up, we can just say no. We can just say, thank you so much for your interest. I don't think this is going to work, and move on to somebody else. So for me, that has been the biggest kind of mindset shift.
Interesting. Maple, I want to turn to you for a moment around expanding revenue. You've been, I think you were the first business hire at Block Club Chicago, and then more have joined and are joining, as you said. I'd be interested in how you are expanding your community of supporters, and how you think about that differently for different levels of engagement. I mentioned up top that Block Club Chicago has been particularly successful in getting subscriptions and reader revenue through this block by block approach. So interested in how you think about that as it relates to donors at higher levels.
Yeah. So plain and simple, I'll just focus on the coverage aspect for a second. But if your work resonates with your readers, they will always support it. So the vast majority of our stories come directly from our readers. We receive questions, tips, and story ideas, and that's what becomes our stories. So readers know that they can come to us at any point in time when they want real answers to real questions that impact their daily lives. And if you want to understand and serve a need, listen to your readers and what they need from you. And another thing that Block Club has really been tackling is going beyond the headlines. So we partner with organizations outside of the media landscape. So for instance, right before the pandemic began, Block Club launched a free Westside resource fair. We got 21 organizations in a room to offer some sort of free resource. And that resource could have been a free meal, legal help, blood screenings, blood pressure screenings, getting help finding a job, and being matched with a mentor. During the pandemic, when students started remote learning, we hosted a virtual back to school event. So readers were able to donate supplies or volunteer at South and West Side organizations that served students. And all of those organizations received everything that they needed thanks to our readers. And then in addition, during the pandemic, we launched our free bilingual coronavirus hotline. We answered more than 1,000 questions, and not only were we answering questions centered around coronavirus, but we were also providing information on rent relief. So many folks had lost their jobs. So many families needed free meals and just additional help. And then the last thing is our reporters and our staff are always so giving of their time to host and moderate panel discussions and important community conversations, the conversations that our readers want to know and want more information on. So we're really meeting people where they are and going beyond the headlines.
Bruce, you talked about your development director, upgrading donors and expanding the revenue stream. I'd be interested in the approach you guys are taking to engage more funders and also take funders from lower levels to higher levels.
So, well, start with the second question first, I guess. Taking funders at one level to a higher level is very much a function of the product. And in that regard, all of our journalists are fundraisers, I suppose. If you have a great product, and as the products of some of the other news organizations in town contract even further, the value to some degree is evident, and we just kind of reinforce that. So yeah, we had a nice year last year in terms of upgrading previous major donors. And now, of course, I've forgotten so I think for all of us, prospecting is just the code we're trying to crack. How do you find new donors? We did an analysis. So we all talk about this audience funnel. You get people to read the site, they subscribe to your newsletter, they become small donors, and they become major donors. And only about 40% of our major donors actually followed that path into becoming a major donor. And so, we're trying to do more donor events, more reader events. We're trying to network more to our current donors. Board goes without saying, we try to network through the board, but we try to network through current donors and have them introduce us to people. But that's really very pick and shovel work. It's hard work. And the hit rate is not huge. It's like what they say about baseball players. If you get a hit 3 out of 10 times, you're a superstar. And I think in this work, it's probably more like, 1 or 2 out of 10 times. So that is the big challenge. We haven't figured it out. We ask that question in webinars like this all the time, and everybody else kind of says the same thing. We're still struggling with that as well, but I guess we're trying to make it up on volume, I suppose.
Jillian or Maple, do you have any reactions to that or further comments on that? I would like to turn to a question that I think for a lot of organizations right now are very focused on. It's January, so for organizations on the calendar year cycle, we're in goal setting mode. How are you setting goals for your revenue team? Are you setting individual goals? Are you setting revenue stream goals? Are you setting top line revenue goals? How are you thinking about that? And how are you organizing your team around it? I'm going to start with Jillian because she has a smile on her face.
Yeah, well, we're literally doing this as we speak. And the answer is all. We're setting obviously top line revenue goals of what we want to hit for fundraising, earned revenue, everything else, with our operating and our 5-year plan in mind. Also, that nimbleness that we talked about in the beginning, looking at the market and saying, what is reasonable, what you thought was possible 2 years ago for instance, an earned revenue may not make sense this year, whereas what you thought your baseline for this year for fundraising might be completely different. You might have done really, really well. So being nimble there and thinking about that. We also had our first round of reviews and goal setting at Capital B which has been great. So that involves, individual goals for our development folks, in addition to meeting the overall goal for what we need for grant and fundraising. So I would say it's not necessarily like a hard, fast rule. I saw somewhere in the question, is it a percentage of their salary or is it a percentage of total goal? And I think it really depends on the person, their seniority, what you're trying to do. So for some people, it might be bring in a number of grants. It might be, bring in 2 renewals and then go out and find one piece of new money. And we hope that it equals this amount. For other people, it might just be a flat dollar amount. For other people, it will be, you're in charge of this entire raising for this entire territory or this entire project or whatever it might be. And then obviously for our head of development, like you're responsible for the whole pie. So your overall goal is hit the number. But even with that, we try and break it down a little bit more. And, we're in January, but I think everyone who does revenue knows, you're not actually trying to do 25% this quarter, 25% next quarter, 25% the quarter after, and then leaving 25% to Q4. Like that is not the goal. The goal is to, get to a certain amount earlier in the year so you have some runway to make up it at the back end. So for us, that's how we're thinking about it. Also, when we look at the bigger picture, just like what number do we want to be at overall, like halfway through the year that we think will put us in great shape for the end of the year.
Awesome. One of our commenters is reminding us it's February 1st because we're moving fast. And also, Jillian, you said something quickly, but I actually think it's a big point, which you said with our 5-year plan in mind. And I think that is a really orienting thing. I have the great privilege of sitting on the Capital B board and have been kind of part of Capital B since the start and have seen the ways having that big 5-year plan, the big plan in mind, the North Star in mind does really help drive revenue. So it was a quick point, but I wanted to elevate it up because I think it really helps organize internally, but maybe more importantly, organize externally, people to see the bigger vision of where you're headed. Maple, I'd love to hear you talk about goals. Are there anything different or that you would add from what Jillian said?
To be honest, I really don't think there's anything to add. I mean, in an individual capacity, everyone has their own individual goals. And then for us as a team, we set very ambitious goals. We have some year-end subscription goals. We have our donation push. We even have an advertising goal. So we have these different buckets or brackets, and we set them together as a team. And then we also have our individual goals as well.
Bruce, anything to add there?
The only thing I'll add is that, as part of our budgeting process, I mean, that's when we set the goals. So that's in October, November. And I do try to work with all of our different, all 2 of our different departments, membership and editorial, really, in terms of her expense budget. But membership, and now that our major gifts person has come on for next year, she'll participate in that process. But a collaborative, it's got to be collaborative just to achieve buy-in to the goals.
Yep. Collaboration is a really key in the goal setting process. I think people really have to feel invested that those goals are real and not just things on a piece of paper. Question from the audience about a key question: board integration into revenue generation process. How are you doing or not doing this? I'm going to let Bruce start with this one because I know he thinks a lot about board governance. And so how is or isn't the board integrated into your revenue generation process?
The board is certainly, there's a baseline of integration into the revenue generation process in that every board member makes some sort of financial contribution commensurate with their financial capacity. Beyond that, some board members are very active in terms of introducing us to people, willingness to host events, coming to events. Others maybe not as active in that way, but are willing to sign appeal letters or thank you notes. And it's all great. All of that participation is helpful. I think we've also been more proactive, more intentional about soliciting board members who are well connected in their various communities. So there's just more potential from the beginning when you have a board member who is connected. But ideally, I'd like to increase board participation at various audience and donor events. I think that just shows enthusiasm and evangelism for the organization, which is important for other donors to observe.
Great. I'm going to turn to another question from our Q&A box. This question, we spend a lot of time thinking about at the American Journalism Project, because Bruce mentioned, we make, for the most part, 3-year investments in organizations. And at the end of the 3 years, we don't do renewals. The point is to build the revenue stream so that there's more increased revenue for the organization, and then that can be reinvested into the organization. This question really lines up with that. It says, how did you think about the runway needed for a new hire in fundraising? Meaning maybe the first year that person raises enough to pay for their own salary and expenses, and then they build prospects and relationships, but then in subsequent years you expect them to make higher goals. Like, how do you think about that? Is there anyone here in particular that would like to answer this? I will hand it to Jillian.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's another one of those questions, not to, be wishy-washy on it, but it really depends on the person. There are people who we are hiring because they've been doing this for a really long time, because they have relationships, and our expectation of them is that they come in, they hit the ground running, and we want to see those relationships bearing fruit, pretty quickly, like in year 1. And then there are other people who we hire and we know are more junior, and what we are hoping for them is that maybe they spend the first year taking some of the admin lift off of the more senior person, so that person can be working their connections, developing new ones, prospecting, getting new money in, and that they're really helping to shepherd, that more junior person along, and they're learning how to reach out to prospects, how to do that work. So maybe their goal and their runway is like a little bit longer, and our expectation is to see a financial return on that, in year 2. But for us, I think the beauty, and one of the things that I love the most about being in a startup, is the ability to be nimble in that way and be flexible in that way, and think really intentionally about who the person is. I would say in almost every single role that we've hired for, what we have had on paper as like, this is like the first 6 months, 100 days, whatever it's going to be, versus where we ended up, it has always changed. It has always shifted based on who that person is, what they're able to do, what we're able to do, where we are as an organization at that time, how much mentoring we're able to give them. All of those things always factor in for us. So I would say the runway in general really, really depends on what level the person is. Like I said, sometimes we're hiring somebody because our expectation is that 60% of the people that we know. So we want you to take over this renewal conversation. We want you to go out and talk to the, 40% of people that you already have relationships with that we don't. And we expect, 20% of those to yield a generative conversation, and 10% of those to yield some sort of new money into our books this year. Whereas somebody else, we might say, we would love for you to figure out how this all works in year 1 and do a little bit of prospecting. And if you get, a couple people to make, major donor money in, great, like that feels good to us. It really depends on who it is. And, we're also hiring based on what we need, right? So we would not hire somebody who's going to need a 2-year runway to get money in the door if what we need is money in the door right now. That would also affect, the position that we're hiring for, the way that we invest in that position, and then the overall structure of what we're doing for hiring in that department for the year.
Thank you, Jillian. I want to also name here that Tracy Powell of the Pivot Fund has dropped in here a YouTube link about turning board directors into fundraisers. There are great tactics to use, everything from putting prospect lists in front of your boards, getting your boards really clear on what the goals are, and helping them learn how to be advocates and talking about organizations and giving them very concrete things to do. So lots of great literature and tools out there to turn to. We have one other question from the audience, and then we are going to wrap this up. It says, we are a very small, hyper-local news org, 3-person total in Lakeland, Florida, and we need more support on the revenue front. We've been approached by a former newspaper and salesperson to represent us. She would add 15 to 20% markup to our sponsorship rates, and that would be her pay. So the advantage here is not having the immediate overhead, but we're cautious about the loss of control and direct relationships. Has anyone had the luck with similar an arrangement? Has anyone had any experience of this, or any quick feedback for this piece of nugget? Anyway, any thought on how to think about it?
I mean, I would say the idea of a commissioned salesperson is not a new concept, so it can work and I'm not sure that a news organization is any different than any other organization in that regard. But I would caution this, that it is an absolute no-no from a fundraising ethics perspective to commission fundraising revenue. That's fine from an earned revenue perspective, but not on the unearned.
I was just gonna throw on there, if you're, I 100% agree with what Bruce said. If what you're concerned about is loss of control, I think there are ways, and loss of relationship with sponsors, there are ways to bake that in, right? In terms of control, you can have final say over every ad that runs. You can have final say over creative. You can have final say over apps. You can veto the sale. You just need to bake that into the process so that everything comes across your desk before it, hits a page. And in terms of like relationship with the sponsors, you could also bake that in, that you want to be in the final closing conversation, or, you could do a meet and greet webinar once a quarter with everyone who has purchased. You could do a in-person mixer at like a local bar or restaurant, and create those relationships so that you're not 100% reliant on somebody who's not with the company.
Nice. Thank you, Jillian, for that good advice. And Bruce, all of you, Maple, Jillian, Bruce, it's really a thrill to hear about how you think about this work. And I am really grateful to all of you in the audience today for listening. And we are cheering you on as you build revenue teams that rock, that ultimately serve communities, because we're getting more great journalism in the hands of people who need it. Haley, I'll let you close us out.
Yes, thank you again, Bruce, Maple, Jillian, and Sarah Beth. It was great, and thank you so much to the audience for your thoughtful questions and comments and sharing resources. We really appreciate you all taking the time to be here and for your engagement. Just wanted to remind you all that we will be sharing out the recording and any resources shared later on, probably sometime next week, so you can look forward to that. Also, through the Zoom events platform, you can directly message other people at the summit, so feel free to message any of the speakers with any follow-up questions you might have. And our next block of programming, let me double check the time. I believe it will begin in about a half hour. Yes, our next programming will be our closing keynote at 3:30, so make sure you don't miss it. And thank you again, everyone. It's so great to see you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.